Hey guys, welcome back to another video. I hope you're having a good week so far and that you're staying safe out there. So it's the end of the week, so it's time to take a look at what's changed in the market week over week. And it's curious considering that Turkey Day is about 2 weeks away. So let's take a look at the changes in carrier population, whether those carriers and trucks are getting absorbed by larger carriers, therefore not decreasing capacity. We'll look at diesel prices, volumes, rejections, and then get into specifics for flatbeds, reefers, and dry vans. And at the end of this video, I'm going to share with you what I noticed in the market for flatbeds and reefers, since these are the two trailers we have been operating. Ready? Let's go! All right, so starting with authorities and the net change in carrier population, we can see that as of last Friday, we lost an additional 380 carriers net. And this includes, of course, those carriers that came in and those that went out. Now, moving on to the total amount of carriers, which is the blue line, the total amount of MCs versus the total freight volume in the market year to date, we can see that carriers year to date decreased by 5%, which is the same exact thing that we saw last week. And in terms of freight volume increased year to date by 19%. Now, some of you guys are wondering whether all those carriers that are going out of business, the net change in carrier population for a year now, are they getting absorbed by those larger carriers in the market? And the answer is not quite. So this is a chart by FTR for hire trucking jobs, and we can see right here that it has decreased and now is decreasing again. And in the month of October, the total amount of for hire trucking jobs decreased by actually 5,000. So the question of whether these carriers are getting absorbed, no, not really. And we also heard that when we talked about the article where big carriers are starting to park their trucks as well and are limiting their hiring activity. All right, now onto the general freight market. Volumes in blue, how much freight is there, and rejections in white, how much of that freight is getting actually rejected and getting pushed into the spot market. So we can see that volumes, they have started increasing as of November right here. And this is not surprising given that we're coming into holiday season and holidays are actually right around the corner. What is upsetting is that tender rejections are continuing to just go down. Currently, rejections are at 3.31, which means again that only 3.31% of that total volume that we saw in the general freight market is getting pushed to the spot market. So if we look at it week over week, we can see that volumes increased by 3% since last week. Again, not surprising, holiday season, while rejections went down by 4.3% since last week. In terms of spot versus contract rates and how far apart they are, nothing changed from last week. Last week it was around 81 cents. This week, it is also 81 cents, which means contract carriers are getting on average 81 cents more than those spot carriers. Something to note that I have never mentioned, and it's my mistake, is that this data is lagging by a few weeks. So what we're really looking at is the end of October or so. So I'm very curious to see what these RFPs will do, because right now is the biggest bidding season, and I'm curious if shippers are going to try to maintain those low shipping costs, those low transportation costs by renegotiating those contracts to a lower price, therefore reducing that gap between contract and spot carriers. But only time will tell. Now with diesel prices, it's another pleasant surprise. Diesel prices are continuing to go down, which is really, really nice. Currently, we're at $4.43 per gallon on average. Now, if we look at this map right here, again, pleasant surprise, we can see that for the most part, it's red, which means that pretty much all markets in the United States have experienced a decrease in diesel prices, with the exception of West Virginia right here, and then we have it right here as well. West Virginia had a little bit of an increase, but everywhere else, decreases in diesel. All right, let's talk about flatbeds. On the spot market, the loads actually saw a surprising little increase in volumes last week, which is surprising given that according to the 5-year pattern, we should be seeing a steady decline in volumes for flatbeds. Now, if we look at the flatbed rates, unfortunately here we're definitely following the 5-year pattern, and we saw a tiny little decrease from last week. Now, currently flatbed rates are around the $2.29 mark on average posted on the load board. Now, if we look at DAT's outbound freight map for flatbeds, we can see that the Pacific Northwest is really good still, according to this map, especially Oregon, as well as some of the South. But these markets, both of them are contracting. Now, from personal experience, the day before yesterday, we ended up near Portland, Oregon. We had to book a load, and I can tell you that the situation improved a little bit in Oregon in the sense of volume. There were 1,010 loads there and 65 trucks posted. Now, I understand not everyone posts their loads. Sometimes people post several times one load, the trucks, but based on how many calls I was getting, I realized that there is significant undercapacity in the market, and the rates also improved a little bit even to better areas. However, of course, if you want a really good rate, you're going to a place like Wyoming, Colorado, maybe Idaho, basically dead markets. Now, if we look at the inbound freight map by DAT, which shows us where these flatbed loads are going, we can see that it's not as colorful as last week. There are not as many red spots, like Wyoming died, South and North Dakota died, but still Colorado, Nebraska, Texas are places where a lot of these loads go. But unfortunately, Colorado, Nebraska, and Texas, especially if you're closer to the Lincoln, Nebraska area, these are dead markets where you can't get out for a decent rate no matter where you are willing to go. Next, we have our reefers, starting with spot volumes, and no surprise here, thankfully. We're following that 5-year pattern. Volumes increased quite a bit for reefers on the spot market last week, and this is because of holiday season. So I'm not going to say I'm surprised. The only thing I'm surprised about is that we're still following that 5-year pattern, considering the situation we're in. Now, if we take a look at reefer spot rates right here, we can see that there was also a nice increase in spot rates as of last week for reefers, and we are following that 5-year pattern. Currently, reefer rates are at around $2.42 per mile for the posted loads. Now, again, this includes averages, right? This is all an average of loads that consist of those long loads that don't pay well, and also those short 200-mile runs for $600 that put the driver at $3 per mile. But we'll talk more about reefers and flatbeds at the end of the video. All right, if we look at the general freight volume in the general market, not just the spot market for reefers, we can see that there are some places which experienced an increase, like for example, Idaho or the Pacific Northwest in general, Phoenix, Arizona, Mississippi, parts of Texas. We have Michigan, Pennsylvania, a lot of the eastern states, although something to consider, except for Maryland, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, everything else here like Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, yes, there was an increase in volume, but look how flat it is. It means that there's no volume to begin with, right? But yeah, there were some increases in volume. The huge decreases happened in Utah, Nebraska, Fargo, North Dakota, parts of Minnesota, and New York, Indiana, Missouri, right? And then there are some random places as well. What about rejections? So for rejections for reefers, this map, I don't want to say it leaves much to be desired, but it does. Except for the Pacific Northwest and around the Wisconsin area, everywhere else there were decreases. I'm not even going to count Wyoming because this is a dead market as it is. But yeah, everywhere else there were decreases in rejections, which means contract carriers are accepting more of the loads they are getting. But the question is, where do you have to go next week if you have a reefer? So in order to grab relatively better opportunities, we're trying to find places that have high volume and high rejections, because that means more stuff gets to the spot market. For reefers, I'm sorry, I have to scroll down here because all my numbers are on my laptop. For reefers, we have, of course, Portland, Oregon. Last week, the rejection rate was 22.38%. This week, it's 29.12%. So there's an increase in rejections. Then we have the Pendleton, Oregon area, which was 21.35% rejection last week. This week, it's 34.2%. So huge increase in rejection, probably because of the I-80, which is starting to close down again, and people are having a hard time getting to these areas. Then we have Twin Falls, Idaho, which last week was 15.25% rejection. This week it's 28.28% rejection, another increase. Then we have Fargo, North Dakota right here, which is 35.56% rejection. And the Midwest, it actually is a huge range from 4% to 35% rejection. But the reason I always say that the Midwest is an interesting place is because there is not a lot of deadheading, relatively to other places that you have to do in order to get to a relatively better market. So for reefers, again, it's the Midwest, the Pacific Northwest, and the northern states. Finally, last but not least, we have our dry vans. So on the spot market, volumes, just like with reefers, saw a nice jump, a bigger jump than what the 5-year pattern actually dictates, right? Which is nice. And we're keeping our fingers crossed that after Thanksgiving, the jump will be even higher in volumes and that it will drag those dry van rates up. I nearly said flatbed. So if we look at the spot market, though, in terms of spot rates, we can see that unfortunately for dry vans, there was a small decrease in rates. It's still around the $1.80 to $1.90 per mile mark. This is the average. And it's weird because here we're not following the 5-year pattern. So what does this tell me? We see that volumes went up, but rates went down. Well, my personal theory is that there were a lot of parked trucks, parked dry vans, waiting. They didn't go out of business, but they also didn't really participate in the current crazy market. And they just unparked their trucks and went into the market trying to grab those relatively better opportunities, hoping that the holiday season is going to, bring some opportunities with it. So this is the only explanation I have. If you have another one, let me know. In the general freight market, in terms of volumes for dry vans, we can see that just like last week, it's all over the place. There were significant decreases in volume. There were some increases in volume and some areas with no change. Mostly on the East Coast, there were decreases in volume, right? In the South, there were a lot of increases. And then in the West Coast, there were some increases. It's all over the place. So let's take a look at rejections for dry vans. Now, rejections are a little bit more interesting. Yeah, there are a lot of decreases, but there are also some significant increases in rejections, especially in the Plains states right here, right? North Dakota, Lincoln, Nebraska, Wyoming, Kansas, Iowa, parts of Minnesota. And then there are some other states like Missouri, Illinois, Arkansas, Louisiana, Massachusetts, North Carolina. I'm not even going to consider the increases in the West Coast because they're flat. There is not much rejection to begin with. But where do you have to go next week if you have a dry van? Well, we still have Green Bay, Wisconsin, which last week was 12.39% rejection. This week it's 11.9% rejection, so that decreased. And of course, still the Midwest market. And here it ranges from 5 to 9% rejection. Definitely very, very different from what it is for a reefer, where it's 4 to 35% rejection. But still, if we're looking at relatively better places, the Midwest is still the place to be. And again, the deadhead is short, relatively, so you can deadhead to a better market area. All right, so again, I'm going to be talking about my experience with flatbeds and reefers because these are the two equipment types we operate. So the number one thing I want to talk about is the fact that reefers saw a jump in volumes and rates last week. Did I feel it? No, absolutely I did not. The reason is because my guy who operates a reefer, he ended up in Georgia, North Carolina. Basically, he was in the Southeast. And their loads pay as low as 90 cents per mile. I'm not even kidding. So basically he had to deadhead 500 miles to go to Ohio to grab the next load. The biggest challenge I see for reefers is being able to stay in those relatively better markets. If you manage to do that, then you're going to be in a much better position than the rest of your competition. Number 2, for flatbeds. For the past month or even more, we have been running only dead markets like Wyoming, Colorado, Idaho, Nebraska, Kansas, North Dakota, and South Dakota, sometimes hitting Oregon and Washington. So I finally figured out a formula that works for us right now, despite being in bad markets and despite the horrible situation with the freight market. Go from Oregon to Colorado for $3.50 per mile. Then from Colorado, deadhead to Kansas. From Kansas, grab a load for almost $3 per mile to California. From California to Idaho, around $2.70 per mile. From Idaho to Washington for around $2.50 to $2.70 per mile. If you end up in Utah, deadhead to Idaho because the loads pay relatively better than in Utah. And basically that's what we have been doing. It's a lot of deadhead and it becomes kind of a game of averages. Anyway, guys, wishing you all an amazing rest of your week and weekend. Be kind to each other. Stay strong through these challenging times and I'll see you in the next video.